Everybody, welcome. Bring the Committee on the Judiciary to order on this Wednesday, February 15th. There are minutes from Monday's meeting in your packet. Before you please review those, we will entertain any corrections, revisions, or modifications to those minutes after the clerk calls the roll to ascertain the presence of a quorum. Mr. Clerk.
Mr. Fast. Mr. Fluharty. Mr. Foster. Mr. Garcia. Mr. Hanson. Mr. Hillenbrand. Mr. Honecker. Mr. Kelly. Mrs. Kimball. Mr. Kirby. Mr. Kump. Mr. Mallow. Mr. Marple. Mr. Martin. Mr. Nestor. Mr. Phillips. Mr. Pritt. Mr. Ridenhour. Mr. Shamblin. Mr. Steele. Mr. Ward. Ms. Warner. Mr. Westfall. Mr. Zeteslow. And Mr. Chairman.
Present. Quorum is present. Are there any additions or revisions, corrections to the minutes? If not, the chair recognizes the gentleman from the 51st to move the minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move that the minutes for February 13, 2023 be approved as presented.
You've heard the gentleman's motion. All those in favor of that motion, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed, please say no. The ayes have it. The minutes are approved as distributed. The first bill on the agenda for consideration is the committee substitute for House Bill 2648. This is a rules bundle. We have Mr. Roskovinsky, who is our guest today, to present these. As we have before on rules bundle, we will go through each CSR section, take a pause, and entertain questions of counsel on those sections. We will also entertain leave of committee requests for testimony in addition to amendments. At the conclusion of the presentation of the entire bundle, we will then move the bill with a motion. So, counsel, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. CSR 64, CSR 26. This is a new rule that explains the responsibilities and administration of the Dangerous Assessment Advisory Board. This was required because of the passage of Senate Bill 702 during the 2021 regular session. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Do all the 64. Is that all of them?
That's that. I thought you wanted to do one CSR at a time.
I was going to do all 64, and then I was going to do all 60.
Okay, you got it. 64 CSR 73. This rule establishes the standards for the provision of basic public health services by local boards of health. This was required because of the passage of House Bill 4113 during the 2002 regular legislative session. CSR 64 CSR 84.
Stand by, counsel. I'm gonna let me. If I wasn't clear, I'll repeat. That does happen from time to time. As you'll notice on the agenda, each of the CSR starts with a number. We're starting with 64. We will go through all of those that start with 64. We will pause before we get to 65, and then we will continue that way until we are fully completed through the rules. Counsel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. 64 CSR 84, the amendments were made to this because of the result of changes in House Bill 4340 during the 2022 regular session. The rule regulates the conduct of medico-legal investigations of the cause of death, sets procedures for postmortem examinations of deceased persons, and examination of substances collected as part of that process. 64 CSR 110, 112, both relate to, 112, yep. I feel like I'm missing one there, but I'm not. Okay. 64 CSR 110 and 112 concerned the length of time that surveillance is kept by a grower or processor or a dispensary, and it is reduced from 2 years to 180 days, and that was required because of a statutory change in 2022.
Thank you, counsel. Are there questions of counsel as to 64 CSR 26? Questions of counsel? Gentleman from the 88.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Counsel, if I could, on CSR 6473.
We'll get to that one in 1 minute. Let's take questions first of CSR 26. 64 CSR 26. Are there any requests for leave of the committee on that rule? Any amendments to that rule? That brings us to consideration of 64 CSR 73. Chair recognizes the gentleman from the 88th for council.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and apologize for being a little premature there. I'm just curious, on page 7, starting section 64, I lost it, there it is, 64-73-7, General Administration of the Local Health Department. That seems to all have been stricken. Did that move somewhere?
It did not. That was the state controlling how the local health departments were going to be administered. Those were removed from statute, so each local health department could decide on their own how they were going to be administered.
Thank you.
Further questions of council? Gentleman from the 51st.
Thank you, council. On the rule, I'm looking page 5, subsection 5.1.4, promotion of healthy lifestyles, including the provision of health education to individuals and communities. That language is being stricken. Do you know why that language is being stricken?
One more time, Delegate, where are you?
Page 5, section 5.1.4. This is CSR 73, correct?
Yes, sir.
And I'm looking at what's online, Secretary of State's website.
The board shall conduct preventative health programs.
Well, 5.1.3.A, right above that is environmental health
I see
protection.
where you're at. Okay.
Yeah.
I got you now. Sorry.
So, on page 5. Do you know why that language is stricken to promotion of healthy lifestyles, including provision of health education to individuals and communities? I'm just wondering if it was circled back in and included somewhere else in new language, or is this just being stricken?
It looks like it's just struck, Delegate. I'll see
Okay.
it real quick.
And then on page 6, 5.4. Yeah, page 6. Right, 5.4 on page 6. It's under, it's below the heading of
I got it.
immunization.
Yes, sir.
The board shall conduct preventative health programs designed to promote healthy behaviors. That language is also stricken. Is that being circled back in and included somewhere else, or is that just being stricken?
I don't see it anywhere else, Delegate,
All right,
unless I'm missing it.
thank you.
Further questions of council? Further questions of council on that rule? Does any member desire leave of the committee to call any witnesses? Are there amendments?
I'm going to,
Gentleman from the
Right one.
51st is perfecting an amendment. Committee will be at ease. Gentleman from the 51st moves to amend the rule by reinserting the stricken language on page 6, which was previously 5.4. Provision read, and if adopted, would again read, the board shall conduct preventative health programs designed to promote healthy behaviors, period.
5,
And on page 5,
5.1.4.
5.1.4, reinserting promotion of healthy lifestyles, including the provision of health education to individuals and communities. Questions of council as to the effect of that amendment to the rule? Gentleman from the 20th.
Council, my question is the amendment. I'm concerned about the drafting of it because actually it would be, the amendment would have to go on page 3, line 10, and say is authorized except for the following amendment, correct? Because the com sub is 2648. Because we can't amend the individual rule, it has to be an amendment to the com sub, correct?
That's correct, Delegate. But I believe that, I mean, I can format it fairly easily, if you would like, sir.
Okay.
The gentleman from the 20th is correct that the amendment would need to be made to the actual bill and not the rule. The chair was in error in his description. Council will reform appropriately.
May I, Mr. Chairman? Delegate Fast moves to amend the bill on page 3, line 10, after the word is authorized by by inserting the words with the following amendments. On page 6, subdivision 5.4 by reinserting the stricken language. And on page 5, subdivision 5.1.4 by reinserting the stricken language.
Gentleman from the 51st asks unanimous consent to reform the motion as described by council. Is there objection? Hearing none, are there questions of council as to the effect of the amendment? Gentleman from the 20th.
I'd just like to see if somebody from DHHR is here for
The leave of the
technical
committee has
witness.
been requested by the gentleman from the 20th to call a witness from Department of Health and Human Resources. Do we have one? Please come to the podium here, introduce yourself to the committee, we'll swear you in, and then the gentleman from the 20th has a few questions.
I'm Amy Atkins, Deputy Commissioner for the Bureau for Public Health, Health Improvement Section.
Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. Gentleman from the 20th.
And my question's on the language that was stricken there. It looks like it was kind of redefining what the local health departments were responsible for. And do you just have any clarification as to why the language was struck?
Yes. The rule is defining the standards for basic public health services, and basic public health services are defined in Chapter 16 of our code, and so those are immunization, communicable and reportable disease prevention control, community health assessment and planning, environmental health services, and threat preparedness services. So the standards you see here define how the local health departments are to deliver those services, and then also work in conjunction with the state for working to improve and assure quality of those services. So for community health assessment and implementation, that's where local boards of health can work with their community partners to assess community health status and work in conjunction with them to define activities that improve health in their community.
And so everything you just said is contained within the new language that was inserted in there, the new underlined language, and it was put in there to more accurately mimic Chapter 16 requirements?
Yes, and provide more clarity around what those functions are.
All right, and so essentially by reinserting this stricken language, we'd be stating some of the same things just twice in a different way? All right, thank you.
Further questions? Further questions for the witness? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Is there further desire to call any witnesses as to the effect of the amendment? Are there any amendments to the amendment? Any secondary amendments? If not, the question before the committee is on adoption of the amendment offered by the gentleman from the 51st. Is there discussion? Gentleman from the 51st?
Close.
Gentleman from the 20.
Thank you. Just according to the previous witness from DHHR, this is updating the language from what it was to more accurately define what is actually in Chapter 16 code now and what the local health departments are doing. And I would urge rejection of the amendment because this is just putting both the current language in and the old language that didn't accurately identify what the responsibilities of the health departments are. So I would urge objection or rejection.
Further discussion for the chair. Recognize gentleman from the 51st to close debate on his amendment. Chair recognizes gentleman from the 51st.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would urge passage. Vague versus specific. Council indicated he didn't see where this was circled back in and included anywhere else. It may be stated vaguely in other language or generalized language, but there's nothing wrong with being specific for the local health departments to include healthy lifestyle, education and programs. If we're talking about disease preventative control, there's nothing wrong with saying healthy lifestyles is going to be part of the program to be specific. So you can have it vague, you can have it specific, doesn't harm the bill, it's more clear. I would urge passage. Adoption.
Question before the committee is on adoption of the motion offered by the gentleman from the 51st. All those in favor of adoption, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, please say no. No. Noes appear to have it.
Division.
Division's called. If you are in favor of adoption, please raise one hand. If you are opposed, please raise one hand. On that question, there are 9 yeses and 14 noes. The amendment is rejected. Are there further amendments to 64 CSR 73? If not, are there questions of council as to 64 CSR 84? Questions of council? Does any member of the committee desire leave to call a witness? Are there any amendments to that rule? If not, are there any questions of council as to 64 CSR 110? Any requests for leave of the committee? Amendments? If not, 64 CSR 112, questions of council? Amendments? If not, council, 65 CSR.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. 65 CSR 13. The purpose of this rule is to implement the financial reporting requirements that were required by statute. All this does is changes the sunset date. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. '65 CSR 34. This is a new rule. This rule establishes the procedures for the collection, retention, use, and disclosure of data from the Uniform Bill Database. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Are there any questions of council as to 65 CSR 13? Any amendments? Any questions of council as to 65 CSR 34? Gentleman from the 51st for council.
Thank you, council. This rule involves limited data set. Can you give us more clarity as to what that is, a limited data set? Or the data, what's going on with this rule?
I defer to the department.
Appropriate time, yes.
Further questions of council on that rule? Gentleman from the 51st requests leave of the committee to call a witness. Do we have a witness? We do. If you would please introduce yourself to the committee, we'll swear you in, and the gentleman from the 51st has a few questions regarding this rule. Can you introduce yourself?
I'm April Robertson, General Counsel with DHHR.
Thank you, Ms. Robinson. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you very much. Gentleman from the 51st.
65 CSR 34. Can you just tell us, give us an explanation of what the purpose of this rule is and the function of it?
This rule is a result of the passage of Senate Bill 553 last year. It required the department to put into the form of a legislative rule the activities that had been going on at the Healthcare Authority for approximately 30-plus years in collecting hospital data, the uniform bill data, precisely, from the Healthcare Authority, from the hospitals in the state of West Virginia.
And just give me a small example what this data would be.
It's de-identified data elements, and mostly it's the cost of hospital services. And the Hospital Association actually is the vendor that has been taking care of the collection of that data for the department.
Would this be a situation where, let's say there's been 15 outbreaks of a certain disease, and so we need to de-identify that, take out Social Security numbers, names, et cetera, et cetera? Is that not what we're talking about?
No, sir.
Can you give me an example of what we are talking about?
It is the cost and the pricing of the services that the hospitals are performing. And there is if you were on the Secretary of State's website earlier, there is a supplementary document that is attached to this rule that explains the submission of all of the data points that are required for this.
This is just involving costs?
Yes.
Okay, I got it. Thank you, very helpful.
Further questions for Ms. Robertson? Further questions? Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Are there any amendments to 65 CSR 34? Not, counsel?
'69 CSR 13, methodologies to examine need for substance use disorder treatment facilities within the state. This extends the sunset from 2023 to 2028. '69 CSR 19, this rule applies to any person to operate the 988 Crisis Hotline Center, which was approved during last year's legislative session. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Are there any questions of council as to 69 CSR 10? Questions of council? Yes. Gentleman from 66 for council.
Council, did I hear you say something about there being a sunset provision related to methadone clinics in this?
No, sir.
Okay.
No, it's just extending a sunset date on a rule for collection of data.
Further questions? Further questions of council? Are there any amendments to 69 CSR 10? Okay. Are there any questions of council as to 69 CSR 13? Are there amendments to that rule? 69 CSR 19, questions of council? Are there amendments? Not. Council, 78?
'78 CSR 1, Child Care Licensing Centers. This updates the rule to provide the West Virginia CARES language and adds a sex offender registry check. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It was 78 CSR 03, minimum licensing requirements for residential child care and treatment facilities. This rule changes the employee to patient ratio for psychiatric residential treatment facilities from 1 to 3 to 1 to 4 during the day and evening hours. And during nighttime sleeping hours, the ratio changes from 1 to 6 to 1 to 8. 78 CSR 18. This rule, family child care facility licensing. This updates this particular code, this rule to the to federal provisions. It involves the reporting of serious injury, and it requires the sex offender registry check. '78 CSR 19, family child care home registration, updates to the CARES language, adds a sex offender registry check. 78 CSR 20, informal relative family home registration, CARES check, sex offender registry check. Out of school time, 78 CSR 21, out of school time child care center licensing, CARES check, sex offender check. 7825, goals for foster children. This rule was repealed because we have removed the statutory authority which required this rule. 7828, this deemed Head Start Child Care Center licenses. This was required because of the passage of House Bill 4662 during the 2022 regular session. This rule establishes standards, procedures for Head Start classrooms overseen by a Head Start agency to be deemed a deemed as licensed child care provider in order to have access to the CARES criminal background check.
Thank you, counsel. Are there questions of counsel as to 78 CSR 1? Are there any amendments to that rule? Questions of counsel as to 78 CSR 3? Are there amendments? Questions of counsel as to 78 CSR 18? Are there any amendments? 78 CSR 19, questions of counsel? Any amendment? Gentleman from the 42nd, for counsel on 78 CSR 19.
I would just ask unanimous consent to go back to 78 CSR 3 for questions of counsel.
Sure. 3 down. No objection.
Yes, it's 78 CSR 3, the minimum licensing requirements.
Yes, sir.
So I got it on the youth group homes, but I'm seeing down here that on the psychiatric residential treatment facility, it's changed from 1 to 3 to 1 to 4 during the day, and then 1 to 6 to 1 to 8 of the evening. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, when it comes to a claim of inadequate staffing, we have a hard and fast rule that we go by the number and not whether or not that staff person was actively engaged in what they were supposed to be doing. So like the federal standard for determining a minimum staffing requirement in a lawsuit not only looks at the number that's on duty, but it also looks at were they, appropriately engaging in their capacity. But the state rule is hard and fast, and it just looks at the number. Is that right?
I'm sorry, Delegate. I should have been more clear. This is the average employee to patient.
Oh, so this is not the OFLAC numbers on, well, it wouldn't be OFLAC for behavioral health, would it?
This is not.
Okay. So I might be just thinking of something else.
So this is not the hard and fast rule. So they will take the average in the circumstances that you are describing if a lawsuit is filed to determine whether or not that average is met.
So we only switched to the hard and fast number on nursing homes. It didn't apply to other medical facilities.
Nursing home does have a hard fast rule. You are correct.
Okay,
Yes.
That's where I messed up. Okay, no, thank you.
Yes, sir.
That's all.
That brings us back to questions of counsel on 78 CSR 19. Are there questions? Are there any amendments to that rule? Questions of counsel as to 78 CSR 20. Are there amendments? 78 CSR 21. Questions of counsel. Are there any amendments to that rule? 78 CSR 25. Questions of counsel. Gentleman from the 79th for counsel.
This is an entire repeal of a rule that has goals for foster children and what's called means of being heard. It sounds like remedies if those goals aren't met.
So this was repealed whenever we did the big foster care reform in 2020, and it was replaced with the Foster Kids Bill of Rights.
Okay, so we did take action to transfer this somewhere else.
Yes, that's correct, sir.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Further questions of council? Are there any amendments to 78 CSR 25? Amendments. 78 CSR 28. Questions of council? Are there any amendments to that rule? Okay, council. On roll.
On a rule, 114A CSR 03, all payer claims database. This rule is not authorized. And as you guys are aware, we have already passed a bill repealing the code section dealing with the all payments cleared database, which is why that rule is not authorized.
Questions of council as to 114A CSR 3. Gentleman from the 20th.
And I understand the chairman stated that this was the final rule, but my understanding it's not, correct?
That's correct. There are some
Okay.
additions to the committee substitute, Mr. Chairman, if I may.
The chair was in the dark. Council?
The committee substitute has added a couple provisions. One is a repeal of another rule concerning the all payer claims database. Another rule concerning public health. This rule was sent to the Health Committee, and this would permit dogs in restaurants if the owner chose to do so with some certain requirements in place. Dogs are already permitted in micro-distilleries, microbreweries, and licensed in private clubs. So this would expand that to restaurants. The final change, two changes on the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner. A legislation passed out of the Senate Health Committee yesterday concerning a procurement organization having a person in the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner, making that person mandatory to have a place within that office. That position shall be funded, grant funded, and provided at no cost to the state. Additionally, there's an amendment concerning the remains of a person from another state, specifically cremation. And if a cremation authorization is issued in another state, it shall be held valid in West Virginia. Those are the changes.
Okay. Gentleman from the 20th.
And those changes, I just don't see them in the comm sub, so that's what I was trying to figure out.
So, Delegate, if you look on page 3, line 6, those are going to be your two chief medical examiners.
Okay. And then where was the other change?
The other change was in the back end, where it's 6412-2, which is the repeal of the all-payer claims database. And the other one is on page 5, top of page 5.
Okay, I see it now. All right, thank you.
Gentleman from the 79th. No. Okay. Further questions of council? Questions of council as to those rules? Gentleman from the 16th.
Council, top of page 5, where it says private clubs to restaurants. We talk about service dogs only or any dog?
Any dog.
Up to the restaurants to say yea or nay?
Up to the restaurant to decide.
Okay, thank you.
Further questions of council? Further questions of council? Are there any amendments? Amendments. Chair recognizes the gentleman from the 51st to move the committee substitute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move that committee substitute for House Bill 2648 be reported to the floor with a recommendation that it do pass.
Heard the gentleman's motion. Is there discussion on that motion? Discussion. If not, the question before the committee is on adoption of the motion offered by the gentleman from the 51st to report out the committee's substitute for House Bill 2648 to the full House with a recommendation that it do pass. All those in favor of that motion, please say aye. Aye. All those opposed to that motion, please say no. The ayes have it. The motion is adopted, and the committee's substitute for House Bill 2648 will be reported to the floor with a recommendation that it do pass. The next bill on the agenda for consideration today is House Bill 3166. Mr. Roskovinsky, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This bill allows a hospital to hold a patient for 72 hours if that person is having a psychiatric emergency. Psychiatric emergency is defined as an incident during which an individual loses control and behaves in a manner that poses substantial likelihood of physical harm to himself, herself, or others. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Are there questions of council? Questions of council? Gentleman from the 42nd.
Council, we worked on the mental hygiene process a couple years ago, and I believe it was a Senate bill that made some alterations in there that I know back home in my county, as well as the neighboring Fayette County, talking to the sheriffs, they've had an absolute time with the local hospital's interpretation of that bill, that they had to have an eval done within like 2 hours, so they're refusing to take them. And I didn't read the bill that way, and I don't think you read the bill that way. Do you know what bill I'm talking about?
Delegate, it's been a while, but I have a general understanding of where you're going, but yes.
Does this help alleviate that issue, or is this unrelated?
So actually, I believe this will help this issue. This right now, you have patients who are leaving the hospital AMA, and then they are harm to themselves or others, which could start the involuntary commitment process. By permitting these hospitals to hold these individuals for 72 hours and getting them right on their meds, this could prevent the involuntary commitment process from kicking in.
Okay, thank you.
Further questions of council? Gentleman from the 53rd.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Hello, council.
Hello, sir.
So is the only change, really the only substantive change right here on line 15?
Yes, sir. So currently, if someone presents at the emergency room, they have this ability to hold those individuals for 72 hours. This allows them to keep a patient, someone who is actually within their care for the same period of time.
Because I'm just reading this here, and it says that they order the involuntary hospitalization of, as it currently stands, an individual who was present at or presented at a hospital emergency room in need of treatment.
That's correct.
So I'm just trying to see how this would really change that at all. Because if somebody's at an emergency room, based on the current language.
They were concerned that it was not clear enough for them to have the authority. So a person presenting in an emergency room is not necessarily a patient whenever they present. So once an individual is admitted to the hospital, they become a patient and therefore would fall under this. It was a very tight reading, sir.
I'm going to support the legislation, but I'm not sure it's needed. But regardless, I thank you.
Thank you.
Further questions of council? Yes, gentleman from the 69th.
Is this represent someone who voluntarily came to the hospital or someone who law enforcement brought to the hospital?
So if a person is presented at the hospital, it could be that someone that law enforcement brought to the hospital, that there's no distinction.
And it's up to the doctors whether or not to admit them?
To hold them for 72 hours, yes.
So they could decline to commit them if the officer thought they should be?
They could hold them for 72 hours, or they could begin the involuntary commitment process. They have many options presented to them whenever an individual presents at an ER.
Okay, thank you.
Further questions of council? Further questions of council? Any member of the committee desire leave to call any witnesses? Are there amendments? Amendments? If not, Chair recognizes the gentleman from the 51st to move the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move that House Bill 3166 be reported to the floor with a recommendation that it do pass.
For the gentleman's motion, is there discussion on that motion? Discussion. If not, the question before the committee is on the motion offered by the gentleman from the 51st to report out House Bill 3166 to the full House with a recommendation that it do pass. All those in favor of that motion, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, please signify by saying no. The ayes have it. The chair declares that motion adopted. House Bill 3166 will be reported to the floor with a recommendation that it do pass. Next bill on the agenda for consideration is Senate Bill 10. Mr. Valentino, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The bill before the committee is committee substitute for Senate Bill 10. The Campus Self-Defense Act. This bill would amend West Virginia Code, Chapter 18B, Article 1, Section 6, Chapter 18B, Article 1B, Section 4, Chapter 18B, Article 2A, Section 4, 18B, 2B, 6, and it would create a new section of code, Chapter 18B, Article 4, Section 5B. The purpose of the committee substitute is to provide for carrying concealed handguns on campuses of institutions of higher education. The existing law is 61714, which is in the dangerous weapons section or article of the code that deals with property owners' abilities to regulate firearms on their property. The committee substitute would amend the various sections of code. The bill appears longer than it is. It amends various sections of code relating to higher education to put a standard clause in there that institutions of higher education can only restrict or regulate carrying concealed handguns pursuant to the new section of code. It creates a new section of code allowing persons with a concealed handgun license to carry a concealed handgun on campus and in the buildings of state institutions of higher education. It limits the requirements to areas and buildings under the custodial possession of the institution and excludes areas rented or leased to private entities. It creates various exceptions where concealed handguns may continue to be restricted pursuant to 61714. It creates certain exemptions from those exceptions for employees required to be in residence halls and required to carry a firearm for their duties. It requires institutions to provide either secure storage lockers in at least one residence hall or make available safes that may be installed in a residence room. Requires policies on such storage rooms and has specific requirement for WVU to provide secure locations in at least two residence halls in Morgantown and one at Beckley and Kaiser campuses. It permits institutions to charge a reasonable fee for use of the storage rooms or safes. Provides that the prohibition does not limit the institution from taking disciplinary action against persons convicted of an offense under 61714 for prohibited carriage of a firearm. Provides a requirement the handgun must be carried concealed, and it has a definition of concealed in the section, and must not be brandished, and provides that violators may be subject to criminal prosecution and internal discipline. Provides a section on limitations and liability, and provides that the section applies to all valid CHLs, which are concealed handgun licenses, both concealed handgun license under 6174 and a provisional concealed handgun license under 6174A, and anyone from another state that has a concealed handgun license that's recognized under 6178A. And there's a delayed effective date of July 1st, 2024.
Thank you, counsel. Are there questions of counsel? Questions of counsel? Questions of counsel? Yes. Gentleman from the 76.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Counsel, under this bill, it relates to someone who holds a concealed carry permit. What are the age regulations on that currently?
For a provisional concealed handgun license, it is 18 to 20. For a full concealed handgun license, it is just 21 and above.
Okay, so this bill would allow somebody under the age of, somebody 18 and older, if they had that provisional license, or 21 and older if they have a regular concealed carry permit, to carry in the certain places that are listed here on campus, or I guess those that are not accepted.
Yes, it would be anyone that has a concealed handgun license that is recognized by the state of West Virginia, or anyone issued a concealed handgun license under 6174 or 6174A, which is the provisional concealed handgun license.
Okay. There's a number of exceptions here. Page 35, starting. So it looks like they're sporting events, so like the Coliseum, for example, at WVU would be accepted in this one, right?
Those exceptions, the bill would not limit the institution of higher education from regulating possession in those places. So correct, yes, that was my understanding of that, would be stadiums, arenas.
So, okay, what do you mean, regulating possession?
Right now, universities regulate possession under 61-714, which is the provision of code that allows, like I said, a property owner or someone in charge of a piece of property to regulate possession of firearms on their premises. So what this provision would say is the prohibitions in subsection A against regulation do not apply, and the universities or colleges can continue to regulate under 61-714 firearm carriage in these areas that are listed.
And so when you say regulate possession, does that mean that they could prohibit possession in those areas, or does it mean something different?
I think it would be up to the university policy. Regulate could mean an outright prohibition, or it could mean other limitations.
Okay, so that subsection B appears to provide local control, which they can decide to use or not use with respect to the regulation of firearms, or I'm sorry, concealed pistol or revolver.
And I don't know that I would characterize it as local control as much as just property owner control. Whoever's in charge of that, because 61-714 doesn't just apply to state facilities, it applies to private entities, hospitals, anybody that wants to regulate firearms or prohibit firearms on their premises. That's the mechanism to do that in the state of West Virginia, is 61-714.
Okay. Subdivision 4 of subsection B, I'm a little confused by this. Can you explain what that means, kind of layman's terms?
In an area of the part you're talking about, area of the property.
Adequate security measures.
Yeah. My assumption in having read that is that if it is there are some, I guess you'd call them gun-free zones that are honor system gun-free zones where there's no magnetometer, there's no ensuring that people coming into that facility don't have a weapon. But then, like buildings like courthouses have magnetometers to check people, body scanners, magnetometers, whatever they have. I think that's what that is intended to cover.
So is that if and again, I'm familiar, Fairmont State, WVU, but it could be any of these higher education institutions. If they decide to set up certain security measures in any particular building, then it's exempt from subsection A?
The way this reads, they would be able to regulate possession in those areas, the areas that are covered by security measures that include metal detectors, wands, that sort of thing.
Okay. Then, the one that I think, at least I've gotten a lot of messages from constituents that's concerning, so I want to make sure I understand it. So the subdivision 12, there is some regulation in on-campus residence halls. So like dormitories, right?
That was my reading, yes.
But, so it exempts the common areas. So if I'm reading this correctly, the higher education entity can regulate, for example, somebody bringing a firearm into their actual dorm room or certain corridors, but they just can't do anything with respect to lounges, dining areas, or studying areas.
Common areas.
Common areas.
I think those are types of common areas. I think that was the intent there.
Okay. And then later on, I guess there's the provision that there has to be some secure location, whether it be lockers or some other way for a person to, I guess when they're not in those areas, to store their firearm. Is that right?
Correct.
And you said that, like, WVU has to build or has to have those types of secured facilities within so many of their locations?
It is listed in here, it has to be, I believe, in one in a residence hall, but there are a couple exceptions for line 70 starts, if West Virginia University chooses to provide secure locations, instead of making safes available to students, it shall provide a secure location in at least 2 on-campus residence halls at its Morgantown campus and 1 at each of its Beckley and Kaiser campuses.
So does that mean that WVU would, for example, and I just use WVU again, I'm sorry, I don't mean to single them out, but it's easier to use them as an example, that they could just select a couple residence halls and that's where the common area situation will apply, or does it still apply to every single on-campus residence?
The common area exemption, or the inability to regulate possession in common areas, applies to all common areas of residence halls. But my reading of this is that the storage facility would have to be in a residence hall. Would have to be at least 1 residence hall, but at the Morgantown campus, 2 residence halls that would, I'm assuming, would be available for a person to securely store their handgun.
Okay. All right. Hey, thank you, counsel. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Further questions of council? Gentleman from the 16th, followed
Thank
by
you,
the
Chair.
gentleman from 79.
Thank you, Chair. Council, just a scenario, if this bill passes and there's an active shooter on campus, Glenville State College, I won't pick on WVU, and a student tries to stop that active shooter, but shoots and misses active shooter and hits a student and kills him accidentally, can they be charged?
Any person that fires a weapon is going to be responsible for the result of the firing of that weapon. So there is a provision for limitation of liability for the institutions in the subsection H, but, my assumption would be, just like every firearm training you'll ever get, you're responsible for the bullet that comes out of your gun.
That's what I thought. Okay. Second question, might not be you, but Mr. Chair, we had some papers, point of inquiry, we had some papers put on our desk. I have a question, whoever put this on our desk. Will you yield?
Let me get.
Okay.
Yep. Further questions of council? Gentleman from the 79th.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to follow up on the question from the gentleman from the 16th about liability. If somebody were to be engaged in a shootout on a college campus, could you explain in more detail the limitation on liability in paragraph H?
Subsection H, starting on line 91, says when a person exercises the rights granted by this section, neither the carrying of concealed pistol or revolver nor any conduct of the person involving a concealed pistol or revolver shall be construed to be an act of the state institution of higher education nor of the state, and no liability for any such action of the person shall be imputed to the state institution of higher education unless they expressly requested or directed the person to carry the weapon.
Okay, so that would not transfer the liability from the shooter to the institution, right?
Correct. That is the purpose of that subsection.
Would there be any other liability should this law go into effect, in the sense that today our institutions have taken steps to prohibit guns on campus, but if they have not taken necessary steps to prohibit guns on campus and then somebody gets killed on campus, would they be liable in some other way? Like, say, if by the victim of the original shooter?
That's probably a question beyond what I can answer here. I mean, would a lawyer potentially try to impute some liability? It's possible. Depending on security measures, depending on police response. I mean, there are a lot of factors that I could think of that would be involved in whether or not you could hold the facility responsible for an intervening criminal act.
Okay, turning to my next question, it's about the cost. What types of additional costs will be required on behalf of these institutions?
I did not see a fiscal note on this, so I'm just unaware of the cost estimate.
Do you know why there's not a fiscal note?
I do not.
Okay. But would some of those costs be, for example, metal detectors or lockers or things like that?
They're not required to install metal detectors, but they are required to install safe storage facilities.
Okay. Now, there's one of the exceptions, actually, not one of the exceptions. Right after all the 12 exceptions, there's paragraph C, which talks about employees whose responsibilities require them to be in an on-campus residence hall. Is the intent of paragraph C there to allow employees to carry weapons within a dorm room?
Well, I wasn't involved in the drafting of this bill, but I don't know which employees that would apply to. I mean, there are campus police, obviously, that are certified law enforcement officers. There could be employees that I'm just unaware of that are tasked with carrying a firearm as part of their employment responsibilities. But if that employee did exist, then this subsection would apply to them.
Would this apply to RAs who, my understanding, live in dorms and are not required to carry handguns but might have a permit?
Well, my reading is if they were required, then it would apply to them.
It seems to me like it says if the responsibilities require them to be in an on-campus residence hall and to hold a license.
You may be correct, Delegate, and I may have misread that. Let me read it again. I think I was imputing something that wasn't there, or inferring something that wasn't there. You are correct. It says employee whose employment responsibilities require him or her to be in an on-campus residence hall and who holds a current valid concealed handgun license is permitted to carry it. I think it's for purposes of his or her employment that is somewhat confusing to me, but it's, I can tell you it says what it says, but you are correct. It could be interpreted that would be, and I don't know I just don't know whether resident advisors are considered employees or not. I mean, it does appear to be limited to employees.
And how would you reconcile that with paragraph 12 right above it that talks about where in on-campus residence halls guns are allowed? Because paragraph 12 seems to put some limitations on that, but paragraph C right below it makes it seem like they're allowed anywhere if you're an employee.
I think it would be an exemption to the exception.
Okay. My last question has to do with special events. So like at WVU, they have the Festival of Ideas and they have guest speakers that come in. Sometimes they're high profile people that require some additional level of security or maybe facing some sort of threat.
I don't know that there is a specific exemption that covers that scenario. But that would be, if it was, somebody with Secret Service detail or some security detail, I mean, that's, there may be some federal interplay that I'm unaware of that would take precedence, where they could clear an area. They might just not let people in the area, I suppose. But I don't have an adequate answer to your question, I'm sorry.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Further questions of council? Gentleman from the 5th.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple questions on liability. It looks like on page 37, subsection D, we're requiring the universities to take an action, one being to secure a location for the storage of a pistol, and two, make available an appropriate safe. And then there's language on the other side here that basically says, well, any action of someone using a gun on campus would not hold the higher education facility liable. But What's the current insurance coverage? How's that work now for, say, WVU? Is it brim coverage?
My belief is it's brim coverage. I don't know whether the limits are $1 million or 1.5 million, but I believe it's brim coverage.
Okay, so I believe it's 1 million limit. And say that WVU is negligent in their actions of securing a location or making an available appropriate safe. It would then fall on the institution, would it not, if there was a lawsuit?
Well, and it would depend on the lawyer making the argument, but when it says when a person exercises the rights granted by this section, neither the carrying of it or the conduct shall be construed to be an act of the state institution. So that would be one potential response to that.
That's one scenario. I'm giving you another scenario, one in which WVU fails to have a secure location in a residence hall or wherever on campus, and they were negligent in providing that, or negligent providing an appropriate safe. I mean, it's not defined what an appropriate safe is, but the point being, if they are negligent in that regard and a lawsuit is filed, they would then be held liable.
Well, I don't know that the exemption 12, B12, I mean, it says what it says, that they can regulate carry in on-campus residence halls except common areas. And then subsection D says that they are required to provide this, secure, safe storage, safe lockers. If those weren't provided, I imagine they would be subject to a claim for mandamus, some type of action, declaratory judgment that they have violated that section, but I don't know that there's a specific interplay between the failure to provide that and a direct cause of action for damages.
Now, does this bill in any way raise the insurance coverage for WVU? Require them to get more insurance coverage?
It does not require them to get more insurance coverage. I'm unaware of the other implications.
Could this legislation then put their insurance coverage at risk? The carrier decides it's too risky, we can't continue to provide coverage?
It is a fairly broad immunity section, so I just don't know in light of that how it would affect coverage.
Okay, that's all I have, thanks.
Further questions to council? Gentleman from the 53rd.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Hello, council.
So I'm going to ask you about a specific situation based from the current law. So let's say you've got somebody who's not a student, they're not a member of faculty, they're just a member of the public who's on the campus. And let's say they are not otherwise prohibited from carrying a firearm. Under the current law, could they come on a college campus right now?
They, depending on the policy, let's just assume that they have a policy under 61.714 saying no firearms, and that is somehow communicated. It is not illegal to carry the firearm onto the facility, but if you are seen with firearm and you are asked to leave or relinquish the firearm and you refuse to do that, then you can be charged with a crime.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Further questions to council? Further questions to council? Gentleman from the 16th asked if the gentleman from the 42nd would yield for a question. He does.
Yes, thank you. So I really appreciate all the papers you give us. For other members, I'm asking a question about the ones that states with NRA back campus carry laws. You got 11 states that have this campus carry, and then you got 22, and West Virginia is one of those, that says states where it is not against state law. Is that against campus carry or against what we?
So right now in West Virginia, our legislature has not made a law that prevents a person from carrying a concealed weapon on a college campus.
Okay.
So it's not, we haven't done anything to make it against the law, but institutional policies at our colleges and universities throughout the state, they put requirements on faculty members as well as students as to whether or not they're allowed to carry concealed on campus. So if you and I were visiting, you mentioned Glenville State earlier, and we're not an employee or we're not a student, we can carry in areas where it's not prohibited if we have a concealed carry license or otherwise, constitutional carry. But a student going to school there or a faculty member could lose their enrollment or lose their job simply for doing what you and I could do, and the institution could do nothing about it.
I wasn't sure. Thank you.
Yes. We are still at questions of council. Are there further questions of council? Does any member of the committee desire leave to call any witness? Gentleman from 79th.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a few just to let you know, but I would like to start
with the first one.
Yeah, with Dr. Chris White.
Doctor, thank you very much. If you please come to the podium, introduce yourself to the committee. Gentleman from the 79th did ask leave of the committee. Is there objection? Hearing none. Please introduce yourself and we'll swear you in.
Okay. Hello, my name is Dr. Chris White. I'm a Mr. Professor at Marshall.
Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes.
Thank you. Gentleman from 79.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Dr. White. I'm over here for being here. You mentioned you're a professor at Marshall University. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay. And do you teach a course related to guns?
Yes, I teach a class on guns in American history.
And what are some of the topics that you cover?
We look at the history of the Second Amendment. We look at the history of the production and dissemination of firearms, the international arms trade, U.S. foreign policy, things like that.
Okay. And then also, are you a former member of the armed services?
Yes, I'm a former Marine infantryman.
Okay. And so I would like to ask a couple questions related to gun training, and specifically the type of training that's required in order to carry guns on campus according to this bill versus the type of training that you as a Marine were required to have. So I wanted to just start by asking you, are you familiar with the training requirements in current state code that it allows your type of training to qualify for a concealed carry permit?
I have to say I've searched for it, and what I've seen is that you can go through, basic questions to get a concealed carry permit, and then you can take a firearms course, but it can be farmed out to various organizations, such as the NRA. They have a course, and other institutions do. There's private instructors. If I were to compare that to what the military and what law enforcement has to go to, it's night and day.
Okay. Can you give some examples of the components of training that you were required to undergo that are different and that directly relate to situations of, say, a good guy with a gun trying to confront a bad guy with a gun?
Yes. If I could convey one concept, it's this, that the military and law enforcement live in a culture of firearms safety that's reinforcing constantly. And so that's the difference between that type of an environment where that's their profession and someone who is just has a concealed carry permit, especially if they're on college campus. It takes 5 weeks of Marine Corps boot camp before we're able to actually even hold one round of ammunition and even fire it. And even then, it's at a controlled environment where you have safety officers all around. They're elevated, they're on the ground too, and every single round is controlled. Every piece of every weapon is controlled as well. And so you compare that to the situation we're dealing with on campus, and it's just completely different. And there's a reason why it takes 5 weeks for them to indoctrinate us into firing that first round. It's because human beings are not inherently safe with firearms.
Mm-hmm. And what are some of the dangers from firearms?
So there's 4 weapon safety rules that are drilled into everybody in law enforcement and in the military. And those 4 weapon safety rules are: treat every weapon as if it's loaded, don't point your weapon at anything you don't intend to destroy, keep your finger straight and off the trigger until you intend to fire, and then the last one is keep your weapon on safe until you intend to fire. So all 4 of those have to be maintained. And in a military and a law enforcement environment, corrections as well, everybody who's a professional in that environment is constantly valuing all 4 of those weapon safety rules, and they're making sure that nobody else is violating them. A private in the military can tell a general to cease fire or to put their weapon down if they believe that it is that they're being unsafe with it. Now, they might be reprimanded afterwards, but that's part of the firearms safety culture that we all have.
Could you explain the difference between what it's like to, say, shoot for sport or shoot at a firing range versus when you're in a situation with an active shooter that you're trying to address?
Yes, and law enforcement can speak to this better than I can in the Marine Corps. For Marine Corps, we didn't really practice as much on active shooters, although we did. But we try to simulate as close as possible to combat situations. And the reason why they do that is because if you're a good marksman, just hitting a target, then that's one thing, but you have to be able to combine that with the adrenaline, which is induced at when things are very chaotic. You have to consider that once bullets are flying down range, it's very loud. The environment changes very quickly. And so the first time you put soldiers or Marines or officers into a situation where it's really loud and chaotic and they're scared, then they fail. They fail over and over and over again, in fact. And that's why they run them through those scenarios so that they can know how to be better at it. We went through scenarios hundreds of times before we actually were considered to be any good at it. And it's just that type of situation, this is not what the average concealed carry permit holder has to have. And I would say when law enforcement responds to an active shooter situation, they're not begging that they can run across somebody who just has a regular concealed carry permit that can help them in their cause, because that person hasn't trained with them. Now, they're hoping they actually don't encounter somebody like that, because they won't know if that person is a threat or not. So in this situation, in college environments, I think we're just adding more fuel to the fire. We're confusing law enforcement. We're diminishing what law enforcement goes through as well. And they have to constantly practice and reinforce and train and re-qualify over and over again.
And my last question is, in these adrenaline situations, like an active shooter, where you've witnessed failures in your training with the Marines, what types of failures have you seen occur?
Oh, great question, because first of all, if your heart rate, if you're on the range and you practice and you fire every few seconds or so when the range master is telling you, okay, commence firing, then you can kind of take a breath and relax and wait till your heartbeat relaxes and then aim and fire. But in a very difficult situation where there's high adrenaline, then your heartbeat jumps all over the place, and so you have to practice steadying your fingers and your hands and all that, and the front sight post with the rear sight post, or if you're talking about with the scope, the same kind of thing. It just jiggles around so much. So that's why you have to go through the practice over and over and over again. You have to have experts who are better than you, your leaders, telling you what you did wrong in an honest way. So all that feedback loop is so important to try and tell you, hey, you were shooting over to the left. Or people who have binoculars and they're making sure that you're zooming in on the proper target. And so, you could accidentally shoot a civilian on accident if you haven't practiced to do that. And I believe that if we just say that it's okay to have a concealed weapons permit and come to college campuses, and this is actually elevating the tension on campus, and it's making students who otherwise wouldn't be afraid, that they're thinking, oh, well, it's a situation where I need to have a concealed weapons permit, and they might think then that they have the ability to defend themselves and others, when really it takes a lot more training than that. It's so much more difficult than just that concealed weapons permit can give them.
Okay, thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Further questions for Dr. White? Further questions? Gentleman from the 51st.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Dr. White. I just wanted to clarify, you spoke at the public hearing this morning, is that correct?
Yes.
And I don't want to put words in your mouth, so I just want to clarify. Did you say that the Second Amendment was qualified for only military and police?
No.
Okay.
Not at all.
I thought that's what I heard, but I just wanted to clarify that, and I appreciate your answer.
I can expand on that if you want.
I just wanted to make sure what I heard or didn't hear. That's all.
Okay.
Further questions for Dr. White? Further questions? Gentleman from the 76th.
You said you wanted to expand on that. I'll go ahead and let you do that.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, sure. So in my class on Guns in America, we have a book that's actually written by Dr. Patrick Charles, who is a former Marine lieutenant in the infantry himself, and he's actually the top historian for the Special Operations Command. And in this book, Armed in America, he details how going back to England and all the way to the original 13 colonies, all the way up through the Constitution, the debates about the Second Amendment, that all of the conversation regulations were surrounding the idea that you had to have a well-regulated militia. They zoomed in on that as a precursor to the second part of the Second Amendment, because it was understood, since they didn't have standing armies, that they needed to have well-regulated militias. And the details Benjamin Franklin and others talked about said we have to have muster, we have to make sure these guys practice. And they said it would be useless, in fact. It would be useless if just firearms ownership alone constituted a well-regulated militia. And so that's, I mean, I don't even think, I don't know if I mentioned the Second Amendment or not, but that's really what I'm alluding to when I talk about there's the historical context. I think that first part is very important. I agree, though, that the Second Amendment is pretty ironclad. That second part says that that Congress is very limited in restricting access in general to firearms, but we also need to have that training.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks.
Further questions for Dr. White? Thank you, Dr. White.
Thank
you
you
for your service.
Thank you.
Gentleman from the 79th? Oh, sorry. Doctor, did you have a question for Dr. White? Yes. Did you have time for? Of course, yeah. Gentleman from the second.
Thank you, Dr. White. I'm sorry that I raised my hand a little bit too late. I've been made aware that there are states who have campus carry. You obviously are, I would say, an expert in guns in America, or at least very knowledgeable in that.
Thank you.
Have we seen in the states that have the right to carry, have we seen an upswing in problems?
So that's a really good question, and I'll admit that I haven't seen evidence that there is an increase in problems yet, but this is also very recent. And so I think the data would have to show that over time we'd have to look at it. I do believe that there is no increase in violence as a result of it. So I don't believe that this is necessarily a problem with active shooters. What I see is it's mostly going to be a problem with accidental discharges. And so accidental discharges, possibly suicides, but I think that when we bring people into the environment and they believe that they're going to be safe because they have the concealed weapons permit, then that can give other people access to those firearms. I don't think they're going to make the mistake. I think it's the other people in the dorm room. The idea of a storage locker being the only standard that we have, what does the military have? What does law enforcement have? Every single round of ammunition has to be accounted for. We have armorers that are guarding the firearms as well. And so if we don't have those kinds of provisions on campus, it just seems like we're giving different standards to the law enforcement on campus than we are to the students.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
Further questions? Further questions? Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for your service. Gentleman from the 79th requests leave of the committee to call a witness.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Objection?
The witness I'd like to call is Dr. Jim McJunkin.
Thank you, Doctor. If you come to the podium here, we'll swear you in, and then the gentleman from the 79th is going to begin with some questions. If you'd introduce yourself first, and then we'll...
My name is Jim McJunkin. I am a retired critical care pediatrician.
Thank you. Doctor, do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes.
Thank you. Gentleman from the 79th.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Dr. McJunkin, for being here. In your career as a critical care pediatrician and since retirement, have you had the opportunity to look at statistics related to suicide and gun violence?
Yes.
Okay. I wanted to ask you about a few statistics that you've brought to my attention. And the first would be, how do guns rank in terms of being one of the leading causes of death among West Virginia children and teens?
Yes. Currently, in a 5-year review, suicide is the second leading cause. Firearm deaths are the second leading cause of deaths in 1 to 19-year-olds in West Virginia. And of those firearm deaths, 60% are suicides.
Okay. So the second leading cause of death among children and teens in West Virginia are firearms. Okay. And then could you tell me a little bit about how West Virginia ranks among other states in terms of suicide deaths and attempts?
Yes. Overall, if you take all ages, we are 6th. We rank 6th in the U.S. And if you take all ages, the number of suicides go up to about 70-some%. But it's quite surprising in our youth that you would have a 60% suicide rate, which actually compares to 35% nationally, the suicide rate.
Now, did you say that the suicide rate, so these are the completed suicides, we rank 6th in the country?
Yes.
Okay, and then what about suicide deaths and attempts? How do we rank?
If you combine suicide deaths and attempts, we rank 4th in the U.S.
Okay, so suicide is already something that we need to be concerned about in terms of child health and welfare
Yes.
in general. Okay. Thank you. Those are all my questions. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Further questions for Dr. McJunkin? Further questions? Thank you, Doctor.
May I make one additional comment?
Did the gentleman from the 79th have an additional question for a comment for Dr. McJunkin?
Okay.
Okay. Would you like to make one more statement?
I just, I don't know whether it was mentioned, but we mentioned that guns are the second leading cause of death in West Virginia children, but I hope we also mentioned that suicide is the leading cause of death in college-age youth, and that access to a firearm increases the risk of suicide threefold, from a study by the American College of Physicians in 2014.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Gentleman from the 79th asks unanimous consent to call a further witness.
I do. I would like to ask Olivia Dowler.
Thank you, Ms. Dowler. If you please introduce yourself to the committee, we'll swear you in, and then the gentleman from the 79th has a few questions.
My name is Olivia Dowler. I'm from Weirton, West Virginia, and I'm a student at West Virginia University serving as the Legislative Affairs Liaison of the student government as well as a tour guide.
You swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Gentleman from the 79th.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for being here to testify. I thought it was important to bring a voice from the student body, somebody who might be impacted by this legislation. So you represent the Student Government Association, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And can you describe just generally the proclamation that the Student Government Association passed recently?
Yeah, on January 18th, 2023, the student government passed a proclamation opposing it entirely. It opposed it on the ground that we oppose all legislation, not just Senate Bill 10, allowing firearms on campus if any else were to be introduced, and also that we support maintaining the autonomy of the university's Board of Governors as the primary decision makers for matters relating to the allowance of concealed carry.
Okay. And based on your personal observations of friends and fellow students, are you aware of mental health issues or a mental health crisis that's going on at your university?
Yeah, so there is definitely a large suicide and mental health crisis. As I spoke about earlier a little bit in the public hearing, there was just an anonymous suicide letter left in our main student union last year. The year before, a student passed from suicide from falling from a university-owned parking garage. And additionally, I have with me, you can see the public crime and fire log that the University Police Department is required to put up the past 90 days. And amongst those, there were 7 suicide threats and 1 suicide attempt. And these have been in different places on campus, including the law school, some residence halls, an engineering building, a parking lot. Additionally, there has been a lot of statistics, and I personally, as a sexual assault survivor, have worked on this, that sexual assault has risen on college campuses, and WVU and other campuses in West Virginia are no exception to that. It's also statistic that rape survivors are 13 times more likely to attempt suicide, and that over 1/3 of women who have been assaulted consider suicide.
And you mentioned sexual assault and rape. I think there's different points of views on how guns might impact that crime on campus. In your experience or the experience of people that you're familiar with, do you think that that would tend to cause fewer or more of those types of episodes?
I think it would definitely increase. I think it would also impact domestic abuse and domestic violence, and especially firearms in the aftermath of sexual assault. I think you would see definitely involved in suicide attempts.
Have you witnessed your fellow students over the age of 18 using alcohol and drugs?
Yes.
Okay. How do you think the interaction between more guns and alcohol and drugs would work out on campus?
High Street, which is lined with bars and clubs. I can't even imagine how high the crime could rise. There is a WVU Today article that was published on November 5th that I also have, where there were 2 shooting incidents right off of campus in downtown Morgantown on October 30th, 2022 and November 5th, 2022, both involving alcohol, but both also did involve a person injured.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Further questions? Gentleman from the 20th.
I was curious, you talked about alcohol combined with guns being an issue on campus. I thought WVU was a dry campus.
I do not have the legal authority to say whether or not WVU is a dry campus, as that's not my area of expertise.
Okay. That's what I was wondering. Thank you.
Further questions? Gentleman from the 76.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Dowler, thank you for being here. In your role as a leader in student government, have you ever had the opportunity to talk to or recruit potential students to come to them?
Yes, especially in my role as a tour guide. I work with that.
Okay, so you actually talk to people coming to the campus and your parents about why they should come to Western University, right?
I lead campus tours anywhere between 3 to 5 times a week.
Is this an issue that you've heard about from parents that are coming on your board?
Yes. I would say at this point it's at least a fourth of tours that I do. They ask about it. They see it in the school newspaper and they ask about it. They ask if that makes me feel unsafe as a female on campus is usually the first question I am asked.
So when they ask you how you feel about it, currently this isn't the law, but it would be the law. What do you tell them?
I tell them that I would feel unsafe on campus if this were to pass into law.
Further questions? Further questions? Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Gentleman from the 79th, ask unanimous consent to call another witness.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have one more witness I'd like to call.
Please.
Eloise Elliott.
Ms. Elliott, if you please come to the podium, introduce yourself to the committee. We'll swear you in, and the gentleman from the 79th has a few questions.
I'm Eloise Elliott. I'm the WVU Faculty Senate Representative to State Government.
Thank you. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you. Gentleman from the 79th.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for being here to testify. Could you briefly describe the resolution that the WVU Faculty Senate passed in January on this matter?
Sure. The Senate, the Faculty Senate voted in opposition to this bill, and they are very concerned with allowing persons to bring concealed deadly weapons onto our campuses and into our classrooms. We believe that allowing firearms onto our campuses by anyone other than trained personnel may have unintended negative consequences to the university community including the public health issues that have been discussed, as those such as accidents, suicides, and other intent to cause fear or harm, as well as the negative effects on recruitment and retention of students, faculty, and staff. So we are requesting that the legislature allow the universities to maintain local control in making these decisions related to firearms on campus.
There are three specific things in the resolution that explain the concerns of the Faculty Senate. One of them you just mentioned was impacts on recruitment and retention, and that was also mentioned by the previous witness. Can you explain a little bit more about what you mean by that? Are you talking about recruiting and retaining students, faculty, staff, or some combination?
Yes, we heard today some students saying that they would be reluctant to come to WVU or to a college in West Virginia if this were passed. But also, I did a little survey with faculty yesterday morning. It's not really a survey. I sent out an email and said, if anyone would like to express their opinions, please send those to me. And overwhelmingly, I got emails from faculty saying they would be very fearful if this passed. They would be afraid to be in their classrooms. They would be afraid what might happen with students if there was any kind of, something would happen that they would have to talk about grades or course performances. And a number of them said, if this passes, I will look for another job outside of West Virginia. In terms of our students, we have 1,400 international students on campus, and the number keeps going down all across the state. I think that it's certainly one of our goals at WVU, and I think it's a state goal as well, to attract more international students. And it is our belief, and a lot of faculty have expressed this, that this would prevent international students, many international students, from coming to West Virginia.
And do those international students pay in-state tuition or out-of-state tuition?
That's a question I don't know the answer to.
Okay.
I think it's different for different students,
Okay.
different areas.
The second type of concern expressed in the resolution is the cost of compliance. Could you explain a little bit more about that concern?
I think, again, that's not really something that comes out of the faculty, is the how we would comply with making all of this work at a university the size of WVU. I think we think of it as, oh, we have to put lockers in some dorms. But I think it's much bigger than that. We have to think about the security, the people who are going to oversee, man that, make sure, just like Chris mentioned, it's not just we're going to put some lockers in there and it's going to work. So I think there's much more to it that I don't really have privy to in terms of that information. But I've heard discussions about that from administration.
Okay, and then the final concern expressed in the resolution is about public health impacts, accidents, suicides, and/or the intent to cause fear or harm. So my first question on that is, do you have information from the Carruthers Center about types of visits related to mental health? And maybe you could just briefly explain what
Sure.
that center is.
Yeah, we've heard a lot about the fear of this helping to facilitate suicide, because we know suicide is such an important health risk with young children, young students in college. Our Carruth Center, which deals with all the mental health services, did share some information with me, and they said over just the last year, 1 year, the appointments that they had scheduled in 1 year went from, in 2021, 7,360 to 7,790, so there was about a 6% increase. But even more astounding to me was that the crisis interventions that were performed went up 315% in one year. Also, 30% of the students that they saw reported self-injury, and 31% reported suicidal thoughts. They also said that 13% report a previous suicide attempt. So I think all of that is very real on university campuses, and we've heard how putting guns on campus will probably just help facilitate that even more.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Further questions? Gentleman from the 80th.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm curious, in your research at WVU, did you find any students in support of this bill or faculty?
I found, as I mentioned, I asked faculty to send me anyone who wanted to speak out about it so I could represent the faculty. I had one faculty out of probably 50 that emailed me that said that he was for this bill because it was our constitutional right. When I didn't look to see what he does at WVU, his role at WVU is not teaching students in class. And I think that's where the majority of the instructors that have the classes, they feel a real fear for this when the students have guns in their classes.
Thank you.
Further questions? Further questions? Gentleman from the 69th.
Dean, do you recall a few years ago when a student at Virginia Tech chained the doors to a classroom building and I think killed 23 students and wounded several others?
Point of order. File outside the scope of the
Let's, to the gentleman. Well,
Is that a question for me?
she is here to testify based on her role as the faculty representative. I'm going to allow leniency on questions as we have with previous witnesses, but let's do our best to narrow those questions to the scope of the testimony for which the witness has been called.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Students that you have, prospective students that want to come to the university, have they expressed any fear of our Lady Mountaineer being armed?
No. Someone did mention that when she first came to WVU and realized that the Mountaineer actually carries a real gun, it really freaked her out. But once she got over, her friends made fun of her and she got over it. So somebody did mention that, but I don't think I don't have a legitimate answer for that.
Okay, thank you. I'll reserve my statement for later.
Gentleman from the 44th.
With us this afternoon. You had mentioned earlier that one of your main fears and some of your colleagues is an increased risk of suicides. Is that correct? In your research in this topic, did you take a look at the 11 states that currently have campus carry laws?
I did not look at their data specifically, no.
So you wouldn't know whether or not the rate of suicides actually did increase once those campus carry laws were enacted?
No, I don't know the answer to that. I just, what I've expressed, my concern is based on what we're seeing that our current students are dealing with at WVU.
Understood.
And so, but I have not compared that to the other 11 states.
Do you think that would be helpful to see if there was in fact an increase in suicides?
Sure. It's always important to look at data.
What about with respect to recruitment or retention in those 11 states? Did you look at those issues since those are fears of yours?
No, I've not looked at any data from the other 11 states.
Same line of questioning with respect to professors leaving. Did you look at the 11 states that currently have campus carry laws to see if in fact professors were inclined to leave?
No, again, I've not looked at any of the data from the other 11 states.
And last question, ma'am. Another concern that you listed as your top concern was the cost of compliance. Did you take the time to look at the costs that were associated in the other 11 states that have enacted campus carry?
No, I think I've already answered that. I have not looked at that.
Thank you. I have no further
Although
questions.
I will say that our administration has looked at that, and they do know a lot more about that. I looked at this from my own faculty and students that are part of WVU, so I did not compare that. But there's someone here in the room, I think, that might be able to answer that question.
So last question. These are concerns that you have, but you don't have any data from states that have already enacted it to back up those concerns.
I'm here to report the concerns of the faculty. That's who I represent.
Thank you. Further questions? Further questions? Yes, gentleman from the 8th.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here today. I know you feel like you're under pressure here, and we don't want you to feel that way. But
I can do it. I'm good.
you're doing a great job, and may I say I'm proud of you. But you mentioned that there was already a high level of stress on campus. Is that correct?
Yes.
What do you attribute that to?
I attribute it to, first of all, our juniors, mostly freshmen. Most of our undergrad students were at some way affected by the pandemic.
Okay.
So that has a real effect that people have not realized yet. Not only just to the students, but also faculty. Faculty had to switch the way they teach everything, the way they deal with students. Students didn't have the same, I don't think, dedication to learning because it was all over the place. And so I feel like this year is the first time that we've kind of gotten back to reality, to how we want to see it happen. So I think hopefully the stress will go down. I think when I think about what stresses everybody out, I think that's mostly it.
Okay, but their stress level, it doesn't have anything to do with guns on campus.
Well, now it does, now that that's an issue. I don't think they thought about it. It came up in, 2019?
Ma'am, if you could just a housekeeping issue, just make sure we've got folks streaming. They'll probably want to hear you.
Okay, sorry. It was an issue in 2019, and the students at that time were again upset about it and concerned about it and fearful. But I don't think it hasn't happened for the last couple of years. So now, I think now that they realize that that's an opportunity, that that's something that's probably going to happen, there is a lot of stress. And I think Olivia and some of the other students who spoke today articulated that really well.
And they did. Just one more question. Do you not think that maybe doing some research with regard to these other colleges that have this type law, do you not think that collecting data from them would have gone a long way to alleviate a lot of the concerns on your own college campus about this?
I do. I think it's helpful for them, particularly if this passes. We will definitely take all of the feedback we've gotten from students and faculty and figure out with the piece of local control that we still have to help everybody feel comfortable and safe and do everything we can to make them feel that, this is the way it is and we're going to meet everybody's needs. I think that, as I mentioned, the administration at our university and at Marshall have come together to really look at all of this. So
I may not have asked that question clearly, and if I didn't, I apologize. Do you not think reaching out to another college campus and talking with them before you come here, so you would have an idea of what the data says in another state on another campus, that in fact crime is down, do you not think that would alleviate some of the concerns on WVU campus or Marshall's campus or Glenville's campus?
I felt that my responsibility was to share with you our campus concerns.
And I appreciate that. But I also try to be proactive. So even if that's my concern, as it would be yours, I think, look out. Let's talk to some of these other campuses and see what happened. Did the sky fall? Did we
Well,
have a
and
problem?
and I appreciate that recommendation, and I'm sure that we'll do that moving forward. Yesterday is when I realized I was speaking at this.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. And you've done a great job. Thank you very much.
Further questions? Further questions? Thank you very much for being here. Does any other member of the committee desire leave to call any witnesses? Gentleman from 76.
Mr. Chairman, I would like to hear from somebody in the administration from either WVU or Marshall or another higher education institution.
For the gentleman's request. You can do that one or this one, either one. Yeah. Please introduce yourself to the committee and we'll swear you in.
Good afternoon. Travis Mollahan, Director of Government Relations for WVU.
You swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
I do.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Mollahan, for being here. The last question that was asked by Delegate Kelly related to whether there's been any communications with other colleges, universities, other states. Has the administration done that?
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about what
Yes.
you've heard?
So let me give you a little bit of history on this issue. I know there are many new members here. I think a campus carry bill has been introduced almost every year dating back to maybe 2014 or 2015. As the bills progressed through the legislature to varying degrees, we began a process, I myself, calling different states, different institutions. We talked to folks from Georgia, from Texas, Kansas, and then President Gee himself talked to other folks at the Big 12, different presidents about campus carry and how it had impacted their universities.
Okay. Did you get any good feedback or that would provide any context on what happened after, how those colleges, universities either dealt with campus carry laws or whether there was any rise in incidences of suicide, gun violence, that type of thing?
There is no, based on my research, which is limited, and I'm not an expert by any means on statistics, but based on my research, there's no empirical evidence to suggest that a campus is safer or more dangerous with the existence of a campus carry law.
Okay. Can you talk a little bit about the implementation of secure locations or safes at WVU and what the costs will be and how you all plan to deal with that?
Sure. Rob Alsop, our Vice President of Strategic Initiatives, spoke to the Senate Judiciary Committee a couple weeks ago and talked a little bit about this. Our estimate from 2019, the fiscal impact we believe to WVU would be about $350,000. That starts from a different point for WVU than it does with other institutions because we have a very large police force. We have metal detectors, we have magnetometers, I think that's how you say that. We have equipment on hand that other universities do not. So while I say $350,000 for WVU, it could be higher for other institutions, but that is our estimate. Again, that was a 2019 figure. I suspect due to inflation and other issues, that number is higher. I think it's also important to point out that there are obviously areas that the bill contemplates that we would be able to prohibit, and there are events, but there are other areas where we would not install magnetometers at every door or whatever. So the degree to which an institution would implement this bill would be drastically different.
So prior to this bill, there is no law that prohibits West Virginia University or any other university from allowing guns on their campuses, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So this is telling you what you can't do But if the university would so decide that they thought it was important, and the faculty and the students and others agreed that firearms should be allowed in some capacity, you could do this right now without legislation.
That is correct.
I asked earlier the Ms. Daly, I think, about recruitment of students, talking with parents. Is that something that you've got more complaints about, or that WVU has concerns about?
Yes. I think our population at WVU is about 50-50 out-of-state, in-state. As many of us in the room are, we're native West Virginians. We grow up around guns. There are some students, both international and from other states, that just don't come from a similar culture that we do. And so I do think that there are families and students who are concerned about that.
And to the degree that individuals would decide not to go to WVU and enrollment would go down, most likely would shift the costs of tuition either on the state of West Virginia or other students, correct?
Yes, that could be true, yes.
Okay. Last question. Has there been any public statement by President Gee, and to the extent you're aware, other college presidents, about the bill and whether they either agree with the bill or oppose it?
Since this bill began running through the legislative process, I think maybe the second week of session in the state Senate, we have been united with our counterparts at Marshall to share with members. Some of you may have seen, I know your inboxes are full from other issues, but I did share copies of the letter that President Gee and President Smith sent, that we do not support statewide campus carry. We believe in local control. We think that the Institutional Board of Governors are best suited to make that decision. So that's been a pretty consistent and clear message. We do, however, recognize that given the vote in the state Senate a few weeks ago, it seems like there's overwhelming support for this bill. So our ask of you would be to maintain the provisions that are in the bill, those protections and safeguards.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Mollahan.
Thank you,
Mr.
Delegate.
Chairman.
Excuse me. Further questions? Gentleman from the 88th, followed by the gentleman from the 53rd.
Thank you, sir. I'm curious, Mr. Mollahan, correct?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. My memory's not that bad. Based upon the position taken by the president of the university, would it surprise you to learn that there are faculty members that have communicated with members of the legislature concerned about reprisals?
It would not surprise me that members of the faculty, staff, or students have probably reached out in support. I can speak for President Gee and our administration. There would be absolutely no reprisal that we would take. We support academic freedom and we support the First Amendment, and we think that our students, faculty, and staff should have the right to express their opinion to either their elected representatives or the folks making decisions on their behalf. So,
thank you. Thank you, Mr.
Gentleman from the 53rd.
Mr. Chairman. So there's been some talk about this idea that perhaps there are some potential students that might not be going to WVU or other institutions because of the fact that we might enact campus carry.
Sure.
But I guess the opposite of that could certainly be true as well, right? That there might be some students that would want to come to institutions of higher learning in West Virginia because of campus carry.
I mean, anything is possible, so I don't dispute your statement there, but I don't have any evidence to prove it one way or the other.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Further questions? Gentleman from the 44th.
Thank you. You had stated earlier that part of the reason that the administration has reservations about this is the extra cost, not only in the amount that it would take to set up the safes and other mechanisms that would be required, but also because your fear that there may be out-of-state students that don't come and that would have to be picked up by
in-state students in the state at large. Are you aware of what the amount of the West Virginia University's endowment is as of right now?
I don't know the exact figure. A couple billion, maybe. I'm not sure.
That's all the question I have.
Okay.
Further questions? Further questions from Mr. Mollahan? Gentleman from the 100th.
Not quite that much, but
You implied that you had looked at some of the other schools, but you haven't looked at the data from those schools relative to statistics. I mean, have you reviewed violent crime data at those schools that have instituted campus carry?
Yeah, and I did, to the gentleman from Marion, I probably jumped over your point, so let me just clarify there. As I stated earlier, I've seen no empirical data one way or the other to suggest there is a negative or positive impact on a college campus or a state because of campus carry. In talking directly to administrators in other states, they also shared that they have not seen rates increase or decrease specifically related to campus carry. There are other factors that could contribute to those rates of suicide going up or whatever. One of them could be the presence of guns. I don't have the science to prove that one way or the other.
Are you aware of any active shooter situations at those schools?
At those schools specific, I would have to remember which, I know University of Georgia, the University of Texas, I'm not aware. There may be some in the past, but I don't know, and I don't know if they occurred while campus carry was in law in those states. So no, Delegate, I do not.
Understand. Okay. Are you aware of any violent incidents involving concealed carry persons?
I'm not, no.
Okay. Has enrollment at those schools declined since they instituted campus carry?
Again, I don't know the specifics. Looking at each state, I can tell you generally enrollment is an issue in higher education nationwide. There are other factors that I'm sure contribute to that, but that is a trend nationwide.
But you don't know whether or not there's been any decrease in enrollment?
No, I said I did not, yeah.
Thank you. That's all I have. Thank you very much, Chairman.
Further questions? Further questions from Mr. Mollahan? Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee.
Are there any other requests by members of this committee to call any witnesses for testimony? Okay, that brings us to our amendment stage. Are there amendments? Are there amendments to the bill? If not, the chair recognizes the gentleman from the 51st to move the committee substitute to the Senate bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move that Senate Bill 10 committee substitute be reported to the floor with a recommendation that it do pass.
The gentleman from the 51st moves that the committee substitute for Senate Bill 10 be reported to the floor with a recommendation that it do pass. Is there discussion? Gentleman from the 46th.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to speak to the bill.
Gentleman may proceed.
Thank you. I really appreciate the passion that many of us have over this kind of legislation, and as my fellow delegate said, even the courage of the witnesses, that you're willing to be called up there and put on the spot. And I really just ask you to feel my spirit when I speak to this bill, because I know it's something we feel really strongly, one way or another, about. And I really hope, as I speak to this bill, that when we walk out of here, we will be just as civil and polite with one another. Your testimony has meant a lot to us. There's a handful of people in this room, maybe just a half a handful of people in this room, that are veterans, or you've been a law enforcement officer, and maybe even a smaller group of us that have actually been in a gunfight. We know what it's like to be shot at. You heard testimony from an expert witness about all the physiological, psychological changes that take place in just a moment when that bullet goes by your head, or you have to put just enough pressure on that trigger to pull it for the first time. And I can tell you as a veteran, and I can speak for the veterans in here and tell you this. Being in a gunfight changes you forever. Taking another human being's life will surely kill a little piece of you. We know this. So this is not a light matter. The whole idea of who carries firearms and where they can carry them, and the responsibility, the magnificent, incredible responsibility of any person to even own a firearm, much less put one on your hip and carry it under your coat in public. It's a huge responsibility. When I was in college, I had a professor that used to say, we are the sum total of our education and our experience. And I added to that much later as I began to teach. We are the sum total of our education, our experience, and whatever spiritual beliefs we may have, whatever they are. In my education, my experience, and my spiritual beliefs, when we have this kind of discussion, takes me back to a gunfight. It's already been mentioned. I know exactly where I was on April 16, 2007. I was in Norris Hall on the campus of Virginia Tech. I know what it's like to walk in a room, into a hallway, into classrooms where 31 people are laying dead on the floor. And it is unlike anything you would ever see in a movie. To have your heart beating out of your chest, blood on the walls, kids laying everywhere, and I committed to myself. I would restrain myself from being too graphic. But it is the reality of this situation. And I was telling someone in the hallway, mentioning that incident, and in all my years as a state trooper, I never went home and talked about work. I could come home from the worst day imaginable. My wife could look at me and say, "How was your day?" And I would say, "It was fine. What's for supper?" Then she'd pick up the newspaper the next day and say, "My gosh, Mike, I didn't know that that's what you were dealing with yesterday. I just never brought it home." But on April 16, 2007, when I finally did come home, late that night, I sat on the foot of my bed to change my clothes, and my wife walked in the room, and she said, "I know where you've been. Please tell me you're okay." And I said, I'm fine. If you could just grab that Windex and some towels so I can get this blood off my shoes, because I'm going to have to wear these tomorrow. I got to be back at 4 o'clock in the morning. I mean, I know we feel so strongly, one way or the other, about the Second Amendment, but so few of us ever experience the outcomes or the results of what it really looks like and what it really feels like. And you know what happens to me? Having been in Norris Hall and seeing 31 dead people in one place at one time, is I can go to Walmart tonight, go down and look for some new floor mats for my vehicle, and somebody on the same aisle, their cell phone will begin to ring, and I'll stop, because that ringtone will sound exactly like the ringtone of one of those kids' cell phone that were ringing off of the hook as their moms and dads across America were seeing the news and they're trying to find their kid, and I'm standing over their kid. Myself and 2 other coworkers made half the death notifications. The first 2 I made by telephone. The others in the middle of the night. The medical examiner's office was so full they wouldn't allow families to go up there. What they would do is they would take a picture of the deceased person. They would fax it to us. We would put it in an envelope and sit down with the family in a room like this, at a table like this, and say, "Look, I got to open this envelope. And it's a picture of your daughter. And I know you don't want to look at it. but this is the way we have to make these identifications until we can get you up there. It's just an unbelievable thing. And so I would say this, certainly, one of us on either side of this issue is going to win the race to the trophy that I call the "I told you so" trophy. If you're sitting here and you're saying, oh my gosh, bad stuff's going to happen, all kinds of accidental discharges are going to occur and people are going to be hurt and killed because we're allowing these firearms everywhere, and it begins to happen, congratulations, you'll be the winner. And you'll be able to say, I told you so. But there are those of us also in this room that have this great fear that another Virginia Tech will take place. And we'll wish to God there was somebody in that place that had a firearm to defend themselves and the people around them, because the Constitution is not a geographical document. It doesn't stop at the campus property line. I know this is tough. I know this is a hard decision because, again, we have to live with however we vote and whatever we get up here and say as we testify. You know how many times we've studied the Columbine video? You know how many I've watched that video no less than 50 or 60 times. And it is disturbing to my heart beyond words. I don't have the vocabulary to tell you what I feel in my heart when I watch that video and I see those kids cowering under those lunch tables begging for their lives. And they have absolutely no capacity to defend themselves. They have neither the weapons nor the personal capacity for violence to even defend themselves, much less anybody else. And I know we have to be careful about this issue, but there's no way that I, as someone who has lived through this and seen it with my own eyes and walked through it, there's no way I could forbid another free, law-abiding American citizen from carrying a firearm and retaining the ability and the capacity to defend theirself or others. God forbid they ever be put in a position to do it. Mr. Chairman, I support this bill, and I do it with a great understanding that there are concerns. There are great concerns. I understand that. But I ask you to also understand my education, my experience, and what I have seen. And I promise I will never utter the words to you, any of you who disagree with me. Later on, I will not utter those words to you, I told you so. I pray to God it never happens. But this is a constitutional matter. Our founding fathers etched these words in the Constitution, that these rights shall not be infringed. Mr. Chairman, I urge support of this legislation. I intend to vote for it. I urge my colleagues to do the same. Thank you.
Further discussion? Further discussion on the motion? Gentleman from the 79.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Second Amendment is near and dear to all of our hearts. Shall not be infringed. That language, I think, means different things to different people. In my opinion, there are boundaries. And I would suggest that people voting for this bill might agree with me, because this bill includes 12 exceptions, 12 boundaries on the Second Amendment. Things like sporting events, things like laboratories that hold toxic chemicals, places on campus that provide mental health counseling. So there's a little bit of a gray area here. The question isn't shall not be infringed versus infringed. The question is, where do you draw the line? And in my opinion, this bill doesn't draw the line in the right place. I have concerns about some of the things that were brought up by witnesses. I have concerns about people, the good guys with the gun, who have not had appropriate training to be able to aim it appropriately when the adrenaline is rushing, when they're trying to do the right thing and stop a shooter. I have concerns about whether additional people might be killed. I have concerns about the potential for accidental discharges. I have concerns about the interaction between drinking and drug use and 18-year-olds who are away from home for the first time with guns, being in situations that are very unfamiliar to them, meeting people from different parts of the state, meeting people from different parts of the country and different parts of the world that they may not be familiar with and may have disagreements with. And I have concerns about the mental health crisis on our college campuses and how many of our students are already having suicidal thoughts, and whether easier access to handguns on campus will result in more deaths. So my opposition to this bill is not because I think it will lead to more bad guys with guns. I think that's going to happen if it's going to happen. My opposition is that I don't think that this draws the boundaries in the right place. And on balance, I think it's going to make people less safe rather than more safe.
Further discussion? Gentleman from the 76th. From the 76th, followed by the gentleman from the 69th.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree with my colleague from the 46th that there are no winners in an "I told you so" trophy competition, and I don't. That shouldn't be a thing, and I certainly don't believe that's what anybody around this table. I hope that's not what people are trying to do. I think it's trying to get at the concerns of the people, of our constituents who have come to us, and there are people who have come to me and sent me emails saying, I think we should do this. And there are others, including faculty members, students, and a number of people from my community that have said, we don't think that we should introduce firearms on campuses with kids of this age. And some people have told me they think that this just doesn't make sense. We haven't had this type of situation, an active shooter in West Virginia. It seems to be happening in so many different places. And I can understand the concerns of those members around the table, because anytime something like that happens, of course you look back and you say, was there anything that we could do? And I certainly, my always eloquent friend from the 46th, I'm sorry for what you've had to experience, what so many of other law enforcement members, families have had to experience with respect to gun violence and those types of tragedies. But like my colleague from the 79th, I have concerns about where the lines are drawn in this bill. And the only point that I would make with respect to the Constitution, the Second Amendment, and this was a point raised by our former colleague in op-ed, Barbara Fleschauer, that the Second Amendment was drafted by James Madison. And in October 4th of 1824, the University of Virginia, which was created by Thomas Jefferson, had a board of directors meeting, and Madison was one of those board of directors. And during that meeting, my understanding is they passed a resolution that said, no student shall within the precincts of the university introduce, keep, or use weapons or arms of any kind. So if you're going back to the founders and saying this is what they meant, they actually was something written at that time by those same founders that says that it wasn't just a uniform right that extended to what we're talking about now. So again, understanding the concerns, and I do appreciate the exceptions that have been put in this bill, and I think that the universities across the state have been put in a tough place. I would prefer, though, local control. I would prefer that each university deal with this in the way that they see fit, and it sounds as though if they felt as though it would be advantageous to allow for campus carry, campus by campus, they could do this right now. But the legislature is forcing them to take an action, and I would prefer that not be the way we do things. So I'll vote against this bill. Thank you.
Gentleman from 69.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be brief in speaking to my colleagues' law enforcement experience. I was fortunate. I was a law enforcement officer for 27 years. I never had to fire my gun, but many times I had it out. But the training that we're talking about for anybody that gets a concealed weapon permit on the campus, the carry education that I'm aware of, the instructors that I know, they teach the safe handling of the gun. They let them go out on the range and fire it. They're familiar with the gun. So it's training, but it's limited. But it's good training that I know about. And the dean, sorry for the confrontation, but the gentleman spoke of the massacre on the Virginia Tech campus. We're familiar with all the ones going around the country. You just had one in the University of Michigan State. Had someone been there with a gun, 8 people might not have got shot, maybe only 1 or 2. We're familiar with the shooting in Texas at the grade school. There was a slow response by the in-town officer who was in charge of school security, and when other officers arrived and plenty of backup, he hesitated, he was in charge, he would not let them go in. They could have saved a lot of lives, but for the lack of response by a police officer. There was a shooting in Texas at a school. There was a deputy at the school. The deputy concealed himself until backup arrived. He could have went in and possibly stopped that shooter. It was a failure of law enforcement. You all remember just a few years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, there was a shooting at a synagogue in Pittsburgh. A man went into the synagogue and shot 1 person. There were people in there who had concealed carry, and they shot the shooter before he could shoot someone else. They were there for that purpose. And I believe that we pass this, we won't have a massacre like Virginia Tech at West Virginia or Marshall at any other school. There will be students or there will be staff who will be trained, who will have the concealed carry, will have the ability to stop a shooter. So I am for the bill, as well as support the Second Amendment. But I vote in favor of this bill, I will. Thank you very much.
Further discussion? Is there further discussion on the motion? If not, the question before the committee is on the motion offered by the gentleman from the 51st, that the committee report out committee substitute for Senate Bill 10 to the full House with a recommendation that it do pass. All those in favor of that motion, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed to that motion, please say no. No. Ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The committee substitute for Senate Bill 10 will be reported to the floor with a recommendation that it do pass. The next bill on the agenda we are not going to take up right now. We're going to allow council to continue on with his next bill, which is House Bill 2567. If there are folks that want to clear the room before we consider that bill, please go ahead. If you want to stick around, obviously feel free to do that as well. Committee will be at ease.